connected world. So before I turn this over to Robert, I just want to do a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded, and you'll be able to find the recording as well as the PowerPoint posted on the NIAPRS website within a couple days, and that's at www.niaprs.org. We are also happy to offer free CEs for today's webinar. So that's one CE, and that's for LMSWs, LCSWs, LMHCs, CPRPs, and New York State OMH and OASAS certified peers. In order to qualify and receive that CE, we ask that you be in the Zoom room and not just dialed in on the phone, and that you complete the evaluation. So all webinar participants will receive an evaluation link via the email address, to the email address that they use to register for today's webinar. And we ask that you click on the link in that email, fill out that evaluation, and then return it back to us within 48 hours so that you can receive your CE. And usually it takes our office between about 6 weeks probably to get that CE over to you. We do want today's webinar to be pretty interactive, so I see you guys are pretty awesome at using the chat box already, so keep going with that. Rob will have several questions for you, and we hope to have some discussion today, so I'll be helping to monitor the chat box. Please also type in your questions, any questions that you have throughout the presentation, and be sure to type those into all panelists and attendees so that we can all see them. I'll be keeping track of those, and we'll be spending some time towards the tail end of the presentation answering any questions that you have. I guess the last thing I'm going to do before I turn this over is to just give a shout out or a plug to our January 22nd webinar. So we had some issues, technical difficulties last week with our winter wellness webinar, and so we had to reschedule that, and it's been rescheduled for January 22nd, which is a Friday, and that's at noon. So we'll encourage you to register for that webinar offering as well, and you can do that on the NIAPRS website. So with that, I'm going to be quiet, and I am going to turn it over to Robert Statham.
Thank you, Daniela, and welcome everyone to this really important topic. I know we've heard a lot about loneliness and understanding about it and the effects of social isolation with COVID and things like that. So welcome again. I'm so glad that you've decided to join us today. There is myself, looking all dapper at that. So I always like to tell a little bit about what NIAPRS is and does. We are a change agent dedicated to improving services, public policies. We're deep into public policy, social conditions for people with mental health, substance use, and trauma-related challenges. We promote this by health, wellness, recovery, and full community inclusion so that all may achieve or realize the potential in their lives. Every Monday we have a mindful moment that is done by our own colleague, Ruth Cologne Wagner. It's recorded on our website. Lots of people have been using this as a tool to kind of help manage during the whole COVID thing. And so join her. She has some wonderful mindfulness moments. And in regard to our topic today, it's interesting to note when the pandemic started, and remember when we were locked down, not going anywhere, we made it a point with the Coalition for Behavioral Health to start connecting with people. We called it the Strive for 5 Challenge. And I just want to continue to ask people to do this, to reach out to people, several times in the next 30 days, particularly people who live alone or that are feeling lonely, maybe some older adults who are really struggling during the pandemic. So today we're going to be talking about some of these objectives and how prevalent social isolation and loneliness is in society. And it has significance for individuals with mental health conditions. We'll be talking about that. We're also going to talk about how it not only impacts your mental health, but your physical health, your emotional health. We know because of the social determinants of health, it's all kind of related. And finally, we have many different slides in the presentation today on strategies and resources to help individuals cultivate meaningful social relationships and connect with other people. That's so important during the time of what we're talking about today. It's interesting to note that this is actually a collective training where we would normally, in normal times, we would come to your agency and provide this training in person. And now, of course, we're doing it virtually. But the topic of loneliness actually started, we put together this webinar and this training back in 2018, even before the pandemic, because we were seeing signs of an increase of really what we would consider a loneliness and social isolation pandemic. So we know that COVID-19 has accelerated it even more. So I want to kind of lay out some terms for people. Aloneness, social isolation, and loneliness. And I'm going to encourage people to use the chat box and note what you think is the difference between these three terms: aloneness, social isolation, and loneliness. Or even if you don't think there is a difference, what do you think about these three terms? And I'll ask Daniela to kind of monitor the chat box and see what kind of feedback we're getting. So what do you think is the difference between these three terms?
You can be alone and not feel lonely. I'm seeing everything come in very quickly.
Yeah.
Aloneness is just being alone, not feeling. So feeling, being by yourself. Loneliness is a feel. I see the word feeling coming up a lot.
Yeah, yeah.
The feeling of being alone even when you're surrounded by others.
Those are spot on.
A factual situation, yep.
Yeah.
Social isolation is forced, this one person has said. Level of hope.
Yeah.
I saw feeling disconnected.
Disconnected, yep.
Yep.
So if we take a look at defining these terms, I'm sure you saw in the chat box that aloneness aloneness can be by choice. Sometimes we actually prefer to be alone. I know after I've had a hard day, sometimes I don't want to be around people. That is my choice. The discrepancy is between the preference and the actual. Negative feeling of feeling alone is again, being social isolated, even with family or friends around. So you may be lonely around family and friends that are right in the same room with you. In terms of social isolation, it's having few social connections that lack any kind of meaningful relationship to you. And that's really what I would refer to as connecting. And loneliness in and of itself, it can be a perception of loneliness. It can be transit or long lasting. We have some individuals that are in our service structure that have been lonely for a long period of time. And finally, it can lead to negative health outcomes. And we're going to be talking about how detrimental these long-term negative health outcomes are. Great to see the chat box kind of exploding there. This slide really talks about the depth of loneliness. And so I'm going to kind of give a resource for everybody today called the Loneliness Workbook. This is developed by Mary Ellen Copeland. She's the person that developed RAP. And this, it's just fascinating to me when in the workbook, she asked the question, what does it mean to you to be lonely? And this was the response that she received in asking that question. And take a look at the deepness and depth of these words: despair, emptiness, incompleteness, devoid of love. I mean, these are very emotive, deep, soul-searing words that describe loneliness. So it should be no surprise that there is a deep impact on a person's health, their physical health and their mental health, when you take a look at the depth of these words, of what it means to be lonely. That's the depth that we're talking about when we're talking about just the concept of loneliness. So how did we get to where we are today? Well, I remember reading an article in the Wall Street Journal in 2018 that talked about the epidemic of loneliness in the UK. And at that point, they identified in the UK that there were 9 million people who had identified as being lonely. That's a lot of people. And it was the UK took such notice of that that they actually established a ministry of loneliness at a cabinet level position within the government. It was so bad. And remember, this was pre-COVID that we're talking about. You know, it's interesting to note that, you know, COVID has really accelerated this epidemic. And, you know, the whole COVID thing has been difficult for so many people who have now kind of moved into the sphere of being lonely or socially isolated. And I can remember back in, you know, March and April when we really started this whole COVID thing. And I live alone. I was a little bit lonely myself. I wasn't going out, wasn't meeting with friends and things like that. And I remember calling my niece for support. And so my niece lives with 5 or 6 people. And, you know, I was telling her, hey, Tegan, you know, I'm feeling a little lonely after work because there's nothing to do. I'm finding myself just watching TV a lot. And she said, well, Rob, I feel for you, but try living with 5 or 6 people that are really getting on your nerves because you can't go anywhere. My point is, we all kind of experienced this loneliness and this being socially isolated because of the pandemic. And even before the pandemic, we were experiencing this. It's interesting to note that in recent decades, the number of people with 0 confidence have tripled. And more adults don't have or belong to a local community. And it's interesting to note, I don't know if anybody's ever heard of the book called Bowling Alone. It was a book by Robert Putnam. It was published in the early 1990s, actually at the dawn of the internet. Great book, great resource. And in this book, Mr. Putnam starts to form a thesis of how Americans at that time were kind of retreating from the public square. And this was in the early 1990s. And then in 2018, there was another book called Alienating America by Tim Carney. And he kind of took Robert Putnam's thesis and expanded it to later in 2018. And he was seeing the signs as well. And some of the things that he took notice of, really, really fascinating stuff. He said, and a lot of times we don't need each other anymore. And he used the example of Google, meaning, you know, back in the day before, you know, we didn't have Google, if I needed to bake a cake, I would probably call somebody, talk to somebody, have, you know, find out how to do that because I can't do that sort of thing. Today, we don't have to do that. We just go to Google and get our answer, or we go to the internet and get our answer. So there's no need to connect with anybody. We also see a lot of people, especially now, obviously a lot of people aren't eating in restaurants, but I can remember before the pandemic, 2 years ago, I went to Red Lobster with my family for Father's Day. And it was fascinating because there weren't too many people in the restaurant on Father's Day, but I saw a long line of drivers for Grubhub and Uber Eats getting the food and going. And we know that's accelerated even more today. But I also noted something about the tables that were around us. And I'm going to demonstrate a pose I saw while I was observing other tables. And I want people to kind of chime into the chat box. What do you think I am doing? Okay, here goes. So what am I doing right now, guys? What do you think I'm doing? And Daniela, you can chime in as well.
So we've got on your phone, on your phone, on your phone, on your phone.
That's right, I'm on my phone. And so here I am in the restaurant observing other people who are supposed to be together sharing a meal, and they're not really there.
That is my biggest pet peeve. And at my dinner table, we actually try to have dinner together as much as we can in case, you know, unless somebody's working. But when we have dinner together, the rule is that phone does not come to the dinner table with you.
Yeah, and I've had people tell me that they take the phone, the cell phone challenge at, you know, when they're out to eat, and they all agree to take their phone and put it in the middle of the table, and nobody has access to that during the meal. Because that's what we're seeing. We're seeing people kind of cut off from each other, even when we're together. And so there's 2 groups in particular that are really experiencing loneliness, and probably even more during COVID. It's people under 25 and over 65. And so if we have individuals who are over 65, that makes a lot of sense that people over 65 would be experiencing loneliness, especially as it relates to COVID, because they're the most vulnerable people that could attract COVID. And so they're not going out. They're not even being visited by their family, or they're not being visited by their grandchildren and things like that. Generally, when we get older, we retire, so we're not a part of the work life that we used to have. Generally, our health declines, and so we may end up getting out of, or maybe going into a nursing home or losing friends that way as well. So it's particularly hard on older Americans. But I'm also interested, and I'd love to hear in the chat box, the prevalence is also high for people under 25. And so why do you think people under 25 would be experiencing loneliness at a higher level than the general population? Why do you suppose that is?
Rob, while people are chatting in, there was a question about if you could just repeat the title of the book that you mentioned after you mentioned Bowling Alone.
Alienating America by Timothy Carney. Another great resource, great book, actually. That came out 2018. Any chats related to why younger people are experiencing loneliness more than ever as well?
So we've got the summary version is that most young people are using their phones and not actually interacting with people. Feel secluded. They have less social contacts, like physical social contacts. Yeah, more connections virtually.
And I would add there's a socioeconomic reason as well, because now young people are coming out of college with such high debt. They're working 2 or 3 jobs. And so lots of people have identified, I'm just too tired to go out and meet people. Especially now, of course, during COVID, where those avenues have kind of, they're not there anymore, right? It's just interesting to note that we live in the most technically connected age in history of civilization, yet the rates of loneliness have doubled during that time. And it really speaks to kind of where we're at. And we all know, obviously, that COVID has accelerated this very, very quickly at that. All right, so I wanted to talk just briefly about social media. And here's a question for the chat box. Do you feel like social media is kind of generating this loneliness and social isolation, or do you think it's actually helping connect? Love to get people's feedback on that one.
Lots of people saying both, actually, which surprises me.
I'm not surprised. The thing about social media, and if I would have asked this question that I'm about to ask before the pandemic, I would have gotten a completely different answer. And sometimes I ask individuals that take this training, I'll ask, were you concerned about your or your family or friends, the amount of time they're spending on social media? And before the pandemic was like, yeah, I'm concerned. They spend too much time on social media. But after the pandemic, it's different, because in a lot of ways, social media has been a lifeline for folks to connect with that can't go out, that aren't getting out in the community because they're fearful of catching the virus or whatever. So it's really interesting to note that it has been a lifeline for a lot of folks. So I'm not surprised that people are actually saying both, because I think it really depends. And if we think about the people that we serve, we found a new way to serve them through our virtual platforms. And some people have actually loved it. And there are a lot of people that actually just really would love to meet face to face. And of course, that's a challenge. Any other chats that you want to call out, Danielle?
Yeah, this last one that just came in, it's a double-edged sword. It's nice to connect on social media. Oops. Somebody just typed in something else and it moved on me.
Yeah.
But it eliminates the need for socializing on purpose, even though it's scary to go out.
Yeah. Well, I totally agree in terms of the double-edged sword, and I'm going to give you a kind of an example of that, the pros and the cons of social media. And we know that one of the big things that happens on social media is bullying. And so just to date myself, when in my day, when young people were bullied, it happened during the school day. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have social media. So you were bullied probably between 8 and 4 p.m., right? And then through social media, though, it's actually expanded. It is now 24/7 people that are bullied online. And not only are they bullied by one person, people chime in and have nasty comments, and just it's piling on of the bullying. And it can, like I said, it can happen nonstop. But the other edge of that coin is through social media, people have found community. People who have been bullied have found support, have been felt a community that has supported them as they have been bullied. So it really does work both ways. And so there's lots of different pros and cons. I sometimes like to talk about FOMO, which I'm not sure if people know what that means, but it stands for fear of missing out. So some of us spend a lot of time on social media because we're afraid of what we're missing. And it's interesting. I didn't even know what the word FOMO was, or the acronym FOMO, until I started a training on this topic. But again, we're so wedded to what we're seeing on social media that when we get to the point that we can't get off because we feel like we're missing out, then it may become an issue for people that are using social media in that way. Any chats that you want to mention, Danielle?
I'm just reading through them. Actually, the one thing I would like to just suggest is, somebody mentioned this in the chat box, so I'd like to echo it. If you want everybody to see your comments, make sure you chat them to all panelists and attendees, because I know that some folks said they were missing out on part of the conversation.
Okay, great. So I want to talk about how we are experiencing social isolation and loneliness. Because one of the things that I really have started to really believe, and due to the COVID-19, I've really felt more in touch with people that I have priorly had delivered services to. And actually through friends of mine who have psychiatric conditions that have experienced social isolation. I actually have a friend that doesn't work. He has a psychiatric disability. And I was lamenting in early March and April that there was nothing for me to do when we were really locked down. And he looked at me and said, "Rob, that's my life every day." And I thought to myself, wow, I'm really connecting with this person right now because I'm experiencing the same thing that this person does every day. So if there's a silver lining in COVID-19, maybe we have become a little bit more, we have a little bit more empathy for people that we're working with, and ourselves as that. So we know that COVID-19, that whole social distancing thing is generally now a part of our life. We know, as I mentioned earlier, that it's affecting older adults and people within our services even more. We do know that when they talk about social distancing, we know, and wearing the mask, obviously, we know that it's for our good. We know that that helps stop spread the disease, or the virus, I should say. But I want to let people know that social distancing does not have to mean social disconnection. We want to be able to connect with people. We are wired, humans are wired to want to connect with people, and we want to use every avenue that we can to connect, whether it be phone, text. I mean, there's lots of different ways to communicate today, and we want to make every effort to do that. And toward the end of the presentation, I have many, many slides on ways that we can be doing that. It's also forced us to work differently. Just the fact that we're having a Zoom session right now is a way in which we're working differently. Lots of us are working from home. We spend a great deal of time on the internet, and we experience something called Zoom fatigue, which is real. And the thing about Zoom is this, of just being on the computer, it takes a lot of energy to focus, to look for mannerisms in which people are communicating. We only see half our bodies now, for the most part, on Zoom. So I have to look more intently at people. I have to listen more intently. I have to listen to the tone of their voice. I have to look for subtle cues in the way that they're moving or the way that they're speaking. That takes energy, and that really saps the energy. It saps the energy to do that. An added factor is we're always on camera on Zoom, or most of the time when we're having a Zoom meeting. And I don't know about anybody else, but that can be exhausting, being on camera or always feeling that you're on. And it's interesting, if we have a conversation with somebody face to face, we're actually on then, but we feel like for some reason when we're on Zoom, we feel like everybody is watching us. And if you've got, 180 people or more that are like on this training, they're not all looking at each other, right? But for some reason, when we're on camera, we really feel that. And that, that's hard. That takes a lot out of you. Not to mention the whole communication piece and how frustrating it may be to, when you're at a meeting and getting in, should I speak now, or am I talking over people, or how does it feel to be talked over? I mean, these are all really very challenging when we're talking about when should I talk, or like I said, am I talking too loud? We're noticing we have so much, we're noticing these things even more. So this Zoom fatigue is really real. And I just want to make a couple of suggestions as how to combat it, which is the first and best thing you should do is in between meetings, take some breaks. Take 2 or 3 minutes to get up and walk around, get something to eat, maybe grab a drink of water. That separation really helps you not feel like you've been on the computer or in Zoom all day. Now, post-holiday depression I want to talk about. And it's interesting that I had a conversation with somebody just this week about their holidays and the fact that their holidays were quite sad, because this was a person who normally, in normal circumstances, was around family, would go to friends' house and exchange gifts and things like that. And there was none of that this year. So the traditions that we've had as far as the holiday season were gone. They were stripped away from us. And there was this loneliness feeling or social isolation feeling that actually has now compounded into the new year. We're used to visiting people and having, if holidays are meaningful for people, if holidays are meaningful for people, that was stripped away. And so that's been really hard for a lot of folks. Not to mention, even pre-holiday or pre-pandemic, holidays are hard anyway. I mean, you're getting together with people. It's challenging sometimes with family members. There's the family dynamics that are going on. You may not get along with family members or friends. It's just hard to put up the front almost that things are going well. And it really, again, it can really sap your energy. It's just kind of putting on that front, so to speak. And so the holidays are a really tough time for us. And not to mention, the food that we're putting in our bodies during the holiday season is lots of sweets and sugars and things like that. And then we decided at the beginning of the year, we're not going to do that anymore. And then there's no sugar rush. So that also combines to the post-holiday depression as well. The other thing I want to mention are things that you can do to really help yourself post-holiday depression, is just take some moments to have some fun, get plenty of sleep. Sleep's so important for your body, for your mind. Eat well. So beginning of the year, we usually start to eat a little bit better. These are all things that can really help you through your post-holiday depression. Very important. And finally, SAD or seasonal affective disorder. It's interesting to note that this affects 10 million people in the United States. That's quite a high number. And that is just the number of people who have been diagnosed with it. I would venture to guess that maybe 20 million. And so it's common that this happens in the winter, although I did learn through my research that there is a spring-summer seasonal affective disorder as well. But if we think about winter or even in the fall, we start to lose sunlight, right? And so it gets dark at 5 o'clock and you may get up in the morning and it's dark, it's always dark. And not to mention, if you live in Rochester, New York, where I'm kind of broadcasting from right now, we have more cloudy days than almost any city in the nation. So not only is it dark at 5 o'clock, but throughout the day it's cloudy. We're not seeing the sunlight. We recently went 19 days without seeing the sun. And so really not seeing the sun and that vitamin D that you need has an effect on your psyche. And so, like I said, there's so many people that are experiencing this that we really have to pay close attention to it. Now, there are some things that we can do to help. There is phototherapy or light therapy that people can do. There's medications that have been helpful for folks. Obviously, talk therapy works. Also, just plain getting some vitamin D into your body is helpful as well. So we all know that we are experiencing our loneliness and social isolation in these 4 manners. All right, so let's talk about connecting. And I want to talk briefly about the social determinants of health and loneliness. We know that where you live, where you grow up, where you age has an impact on our physical health, our emotional health, our mental health. So the neighborhood in which you're living could contribute to your loneliness. If you're living in an area where it's a high crime area and you don't want to go out because you're fearful, you're actually fearful, that will impact loneliness and social isolation. Or if you're living way out and maybe in the Adirondacks area and there's not just a lot of people around, that is also going to impact you as well. If you're not working, and we know that a lot of people who have psychiatric conditions don't work, less than 10% of the population who have psychiatric conditions don't work. That's one of the areas, work is where we meet people and develop friendships and things like that. So if they're not plugged into work, that again could be contributing to their loneliness. The other thing I want to mention is just our general overall health and how that's impacted. It's interesting to note that, you know, when we're lonely, we tend to gravitate towards something called comfort foods. And these are foods like sugars and cakes and, you know, chips and dip and those things that are unhealthy for us, the things that we're putting into our body, has an impact on our mental health and our physical health. So our bodies start to deteriorate, and those, you know, those unhealthy foods can lead to a lot of things like diabetes. It can lead to high blood pressure, all the things that affect our physical health, all starting from that stage of loneliness. And so we really want to take that into account. Now, also, obviously, it affects our mental health. We know that there's a reciprocal relationship or connection between depression and loneliness. Works kind of both ways. And I want to just briefly mention this study that was done. It is an excellent study. It's actually still going on. It was the Harvard Study of Adult Development. It's still going on. It started in the 1940s. And there's still a couple people left that were a part of that study. And they studied 2 groups of individuals. They studied people that went to Harvard in the Boston area, and they studied inner city residents who did not go to Harvard. And it's interesting, they came up with the same thing for both distinct groups, and that was this: close relationships, more than money or fame, are what keep people happy throughout their lives. Meaning, it was about the close relationships more than money or fame. And when we think about our lives today, what are most people really chasing today? More than ever, I see people chasing money and fame and likes on social media. Although I will say the pandemic has kind of brought that back a little bit to maybe we're concentrating on the things that matter most. And it's not to say that both groups of people had perfect lives. They had tragedies in their lives. They had people die. They were sick. And here's the thing, despite that, despite the challenges, it was those close relationships that helped to delay the mental and physical decline of both groups. Didn't matter which group participated. Fascinating study if you want to dive deeper into that one. So within our system, in our behavioral health system, why would people be lonely? And there's lots of reasons why. Obviously, there's stigma that's still out there for people. Sometimes it's internalized at that. People's self-esteem take a beating, or a feeling of otherness as well. Shame or trauma has an impact. Maybe it's difficulty relating to others. Maybe it's where they're living. It could be the culture. It could be discrimination, not being accepted by large portions of the population. Maybe it's even access to community resources. So there's so much out there that really plays a part in terms of people not feeling, or to people feeling lonely. Danielle, I want to take a quick second and check the chat box if there's any chats that you want to think would be good to share at this point.
Yeah, actually someone just, right before you switch slides, someone just chatted in if you could help define state the definition of close relationship. So what exactly do you mean when you say close relationship?
Well, I would say, I think that's really up to the individual to define. But if I were to talk about myself and what close relationships would mean, I think it would be one of those people that I could call day or night, that I may have something going on, a problem that I may want to talk to that person, but it's also somebody that I want to share life with, share the joys of life, not just the problems that I may have. And I'm not saying it doesn't have to be a person that's face-to-face, especially in COVID. It could be a text that I get that says to me, just thinking about you today. Those things matter. It's one thing, Facebook has taught us that we can have a lot of friends, but it's the depth of those connections that really matter. So I would define close relationships in that way. And again, I think to be fair, I think everybody can define it in their own way. Any other chats stand out, Danielle?
There's been a little chatting back and forth about various groups, so different ways of staying connected. So folks are talking about like groups through the library, groups through their programs, just different ways and ideas that people can sort of stay connected and be able to actually see each other while they can't be in the same physical space. So that's been great.
Well, that's actually a great segue to what we're going to be talking about. How do we combat it? How do we start to help people feel connected? I don't know if you saw this, if it was in the chat box or not, but there's a website called Meetup.com. And this is a website that actually helps people to connect. I actually had a friend that has used it in the past. My friend was looking for somebody to go rock climbing. She didn't have any friends that did that sort of thing. And so she went on the website and she went on meetup.com and joined a rock climbing group and went out rock climbing with people that she didn't even know. And it's interesting, I asked her about it after she had gone, and I said, well, how was it? And she goes, Rob, it was okay. I still felt a little lonely. And I said, exactly. Because you know what, the thing about forming friendships and making connections is it's hard. Generally, we don't just automatically connect with somebody after one time. It takes work. Friendship really is work. And so I encouraged her to keep going, because you're going to find that you're warming up to people more and more. And so meetup.com is a great resource. Any kind of they have groups on poetry there. People like poetry, people like music, people like to take walks. Meetup.com is a great resource. It's really the portal to doing a lot of things with other people. So that's a great resource. So I put together a lot of different things that we can be doing to combat social isolation, particularly for people that we're serving. And so some of these here, connecting with people you work with on a regular basis is really important. Maybe giving out or providing information and resources, which is exactly what's going on in the chat room. So I love that. Helping people to identify and connect with a network, maybe your network, maybe helping that person identify that, who is in their own network as well. Encouraging people to think of and reach out to family if they have good family relationships and the family is a support to them. That may be something that you could do there. Maybe creating a virtual community or joining a virtual community. We're seeing a lot more of people joining this virtual world because of where we're at in our COVID-19 realities. Maybe it's developing a mobile support network that includes Zoom, FaceTime, or Facebook messaging, texting, direct phone contact with people, just calling people up. Maybe even, I've heard of some agencies that have gone to people's houses and just kind of been outside the window to greet them. So there's all different ways that we can connect. And maybe updating your social media pages or your websites with new information about tele-delivered or peer support services that are out there for folks. And getting that information out to the people that you support as well. Identify some challenges that people are having. They may be having challenges as it relates to income. We've seen a lot of people who have lost their jobs and are really experiencing social isolation, the whole empty time syndrome where they have lots of time on their hands. It can be really tough. Maybe there's a lack of food, even housing, lack of housing. And just being able to share some of the resources in those three areas, I think is going to be really important to kind of connect people. Identifying those open mutual help, self-help peer support groups that are out there. They're out there. They do a tremendous value in helping people kind of connect from a peer level. Making sure that there's easy access for all. Maybe it's just like making those daily outreach calls to make sure people are doing okay. Maybe conducting some kind of a needs assessment to see what their needs may be. Mailing out resources, again, posting more stuff on Facebook and on your website. If you have a newsletter, that can be really helpful in terms of giving people information on either tele-delivered services or virtual groups that are going on. There's technology that can help us. As well as maybe free cognitive games that we can help people access to keep their mind stimulated. We also want to reach out to people that don't have the technology, and that means picking up the old phone and using the phone to connect with people, or visiting somebody if they feel like they're safe in doing so. Supporting the person in any way that you can through your network and their own network is crucial as well. Again, lots of our organizations have 24/7 helplines that are great, connecting people to therapists, peer mentors, those kinds of things. I love this second bullet here, which is self-disclosure. And really it's, that's where we have the connection piece that we're all kind of struggling in this area. We're all dealing with some of the issues relating to loneliness and social isolation. And COVID has really made that pretty clear that we are kind of all in the same boat. And I think that creates a real powerful connection when we have that in common with the people that we're supporting, not to mention the people that we do life with every day. Maybe it's encouraging the use of positive affirmations for people. Maybe mindfulness exercises that have been helpful to reduce stress and anxiety around fear of being lonely. The mindfulness moment that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, Ruth does an excellent job on those. That would be helpful for people as well. Just some more examples here. And I want to give as many examples as possible. Peer groups, as I said, is again, very, very important to connect people in that way. Volunteering, we know that that's not as easy today during COVID, but when we get past the pandemic, and we will, getting people out into the community, and I'm talking about the general community. I'm not really talking about our mental health community. I'm talking about joining the community where we all belong, and that is the bigger community. And when people volunteer, it's a great way, it's a great path to really working in a paid position and increasing their wealth and their income that way too. And we get to know people when we're working. So anytime you can help people get out into the community, whether it be volunteering or working, is really helpful that for that person who may be experiencing loneliness or social isolation at that. When we get back past the pandemic, again, there'll be more groups to join. There'll be activities that we can be a part of as well. When talking about an individual practitioner, the stuff that we can be doing is actually exploring the perceptions of loneliness with people, kind of helping people reflect on what they're feeling in terms of loneliness, and developing strategies to help people connect with others is so important. If your program is open and you have a number of people that go to the program, maybe somebody who's new is coming into the program, maybe you might pair them up with somebody who's been there a while to kind of show them the ropes and a buddy that they can be a part of. Or maybe you connect somebody to what they call a texting buddy. And that's somebody that will kind of get in touch with them and kind of help them when they're not together in that program or service. It's also important, as I said earlier, from this therapeutic supportive model, we're talking about therapeutic relationship, to model what it means to have a connection. There are lots of folks within our service system that have never really had a supportive connection. And so in a way, we're kind of modeling what that would look like and helping people learn what that looks like and actually feel what it looks like to have a support, and to introduce, obviously, people to social connections outside of our services. And maybe working on goals for social integration with that person, or to improve their connect people that are outside of the mental health system. Maybe we're working with that person to help kind of drive down those negative thoughts that maybe drive them toward loneliness or isolation. There's plenty of work that can be done. I would also highly suggest Mary Ellen Copeland's Loneliness Workbook, because it's just packed with ideas, strategies, and really gets people thinking and reflecting. Now, again, Mary Ellen Copeland in the Loneliness Workbook talks about 5 people, 5 supporters that people can connect with. And it's interesting that she does the number 5, because that's when she's talking about RAP, she talks about the same thing. And these are just connecting people. And consider this for yourself as well. Connecting yourself to 5 people that is there for you, that you have somebody to talk to, the joys, the loves, the highs of your life, and those that you need to connect with. Just general companionship, and maybe helping out in terms of maybe decision making in your life, somebody to bounce ideas off of, or maybe it's just somebody just to have a good time, to have fun with, to enjoy life with. That's super important. So I mentioned in the beginning of the training, again out of the Mary Ellen Copeland Workbook, about what it felt like to be lonely. And remember those words and how deep those words were. So Mary Ellen Copeland in her book also asks the opposite question. What is it like to not feel lonely? And again, these words are just as deep, but on the other end of that spectrum. Sharing a common bond or experience, feeling loved, a connection such as that even when you're by yourself, you still feel bonded to someone. A sense of belonging, or I could go through all of these examples. And again, it's the depth of these words that has such an impact on us. So when you're helping somebody through their loneliness and get people connected and form relationships with people and get them out of their isolation, we're actually helping them with their physical health, their mental health, their emotional health, because remember the depth of these words. You're helping so many ways. It's really, really astounding how there's such a connection between loneliness and all of our health, not to mention all those social determinations of health as well. And lastly, I want to say that this is us. I know I've talked a lot about individuals in our service, but any of those strategies that I mentioned, we should be applying to our own lives, the lives of people that we know, and the lives of our coworkers. This is an opportunity to connect and deepen our relationships with each other, because if we found out anything through COVID-19, we need each other. We need connection. And this is a time that we can do this. And like I said, I'm not just talking about people we serve, I'm talking about all of us. Connecting with people is so important. Maybe you actually take that phone challenge that I mentioned earlier in the presentation about if you're having dinner with a bunch of people, not more than 10 though, you take your phones out and you give people their full attention that they deserve. And you really connect to the people that are around you. You give people full attention, because I know how many people, been on the other end of that, where you're having a conversation with somebody, they're on their phone, and you just don't feel like that they're there with you. Here's the other thing I want to make a mention also, is support others in their circle or in your circle that be lonely, or that's our role. And we will get through this pandemic, I have no doubt. I think we'll be better for it. And I think that we will we'll connect with people more and more after we come out of this. But people need us now. We need to connect now. So take the time to do that. Any questions, Daniela, or any chats that we want to talk about?
Yep. So there are a couple, definitely one that I wanted to mention. There were a couple of comments rather around not just dealing with the pandemic and the issue of isolation around the pandemic, but also around violence against people of color. And I know that that's something that many people are, is on the forefront for a lot of folks. So I wanted to mention that and see if you wanted to add anything around that.
I think that's the real deal. We have to make people that are different than ourselves. Our discussion on social media is we tend to social these chambers and these tribes, and we're not really reaching out to people that are different than us. And I think the number one way that we can help end racism in this country and really around the world is to connect with people that are different than you. Form bonds and connections with people that look differently, that are different than you. That is super important.
I totally agree. The other comment was around access. So how do we help people who perhaps don't really have access to the internet? They don't have a smartphone or other way of sort of connecting with people online. So sometimes access can be difficult because of, people's, different situations.
Yes, and I did mention that earlier, that a lot of the folks that we work may not have the technology that we have. They don't have access to Zoom, and that's a struggle. However, most people do have a phone, and so just a call or a text. I know the Obama phones have limited minutes on them, but and maybe it's just kind of going to their house and just being outside, and just kind of waving and saying, "Here, I see you. I'm not forgetting about you," type of thing. But it's not easy.
All right, someone actually just chatted in the chat box that Cuomo's trying to get internet for everyone. Wouldn't that be cool?
Yeah, I saw that as part of the state of the state
Yep.
that he was looking into that, which I think's needed, because it's the way that we connect always, right?
Absolutely. All right, so The only other things in the chat box are that you've done an amazing job today. So I want to echo that because I certainly agree. Want to thank all of our participants for showing up today and being with us as you do, twice a month. NIAPRS has been putting on free webinars twice a month, and we're really happy that we've started doing this and that we can continue to do this for you. It's a way for us to sort of keep our connections with you folks. So we thank you for showing up.
And Daniela, I just want to make mention that this is a training that the collective delivers to agencies. And so we'd be more than happy. It's actually a 2-hour training that we would be more than willing to Zoom into your agency and conduct this training.
And I'm sure there are other trainings as well. Did you want to mention how folks can take advantage of the other collective trainings too while we're closing out?
You can go to our website under the collective, and there's a number of different people you can contact. There's Ruth Cologne Wagner, who is the director, and there's Larry Huckwald, which is my colleague, and myself.
All right. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you so much, Rob, for being our presenter today. And I hope all of you have a great rest of your afternoon and continue to stay safe.
Thanks, everybody.